right, everybody. I've got another very special guest for you all. I'm welcoming back to the show Mr. Benjamin Morse. Welcome to the show, Benjamin.
Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you back. The book we were talking about is We Are Scarlet Twilight. Had you on a while back for issue one. You're now all the way to issue four, completing the series or the first arc.
hmm
We'll get into which one it is later, but and doing the trade paperback. So I'm really excited the book's kind of coming to a conclusion and that it seems to be successful for you. So first, congrats on everything with the book.
Thanks. Thank you.
I was lucky enough to get a chance to read the entire thing, so we will not be spoiling anything here today, but we will be talking in depth about the book. So let's start with let's do a quick if in case for the newcomers or somebody
Mhm.
who didn't listen to that interview, what is We Are Scarlet Twilight?
We Are Scarlet Twilight is a comic adventure that's a throwback to the sort of stories you saw in the golden age of comics or the pulps, the heroes like the Shadow and Flash Gordon, their type of stories. It concerns a crime fighter named Captain Lancet, who's sort of a classic 1930s two-fisted crime buster, but he has a dark secret that we learn about in issue one. Through the story in issue one, he ends up losing a battle to his greatest arch adversary and waking up a little over 100 years in the future to a world where she's taken over. So the rest of the story after that concerns figuring out a little bit more about Captain Lancet and his secrets, and also figuring out how he's going to take down the villains that have sort of overthrown humanity through the rest of the story.
Yeah, and I've been pitching it around to people I know it reminds me a lot of in terms of the not necessarily the art but the aesthetic of Batman the animated series
hmm
mixed with kind of a Captain America feel to it. It was kind of like the quick elevator pitch I've been given. Do you think that's good
Oh
or
yeah, yeah, 100%. In fact, there's I don't know if the covered issue too was like really direct homage to Batman the animated series. The way they would do it actually is almost could have been pulled from the opening titles of that, where they're the red sky, blurry black buildings, and blue lights on the buildings. It's one of my favorite frames of any animation, and so that was really just taken from there whenever I could. But yeah, the Batman animated series was a gigantic influence on the look of it, as was the Fleischer Brothers cartoons from the 40s, the Superman ones, that were of course a big influence on Batman as well.
yeah, so I think my audience can tell why I like this book so much because we already hit two of my favorite things in comics, and then one of the big twist of it also hits one of my favorite things. It's just the media in general, which I won't spoil, but
We can spoil that one.
was really cool.
I
The
like to
issue
say
one
when
twist.
sure, I like to say when I'm spoiling some things, like it seems like a big spoiler, but those aren't the good ones. So there's many more where that came from. So yeah, we could spoil that.
Okay, so yeah, so everybody out there, the big spoilers that Captain Lancet's a vampire, and so everybody knows how much I love vampires and the Dracula mythos and all that. So you hit my three of my top five probably in terms of
Awesome.
media and everything. So yeah, I guess where to start. So the book, the first three issues you were doing on Kickstarter, all funded, did pretty
hmm
well for you. And then for this one, now you're doing issue four, but you're doing kind of a double crowdfunding with the issue four and
hmm
the trade. So I guess start with what was the decision that went into doing both of them together as opposed to two separate campaigns for these?
the main thing, and this is really informs also the decision to go over to Zoop, is shipping. Really was crazy. The way shipping costs. I mean, they were pretty expensive when I started We Are Scarlet Twilight, but they just continue to rise and rise. And what's worse is not just the cost, of course, that is bad, but you almost have to sit when you're crowdfunding a book. You generally are doing it, in advance of most of the work. So you also don't know how much things are going to change during the time you're doing the book. You're going to charge a certain amount for shipping, unless you're on like BackerKit or something like that, and then you're surprising your backers, which I don't want to do. But given the time frame it takes to produce an issue, especially when I'm doing it all myself, there's just way too much volatility in there. So I had a lot of delays with three, and I was really unhappy about. And I look at all the support I've gotten on this series, and I thought I've got to do something about that, or at least see if I can. And I'd been talking to Zoop for a while, I was going to do a different book there down the line, and thought, it actually makes sense to maybe transition over to Zoop right now for number 4 and the hardcover. That way we have things where people can catch up with all the issues if they want, get them in one shipment, get the hardcover as well, get that in one shipment, and really make things a lot easier. So at least, if nothing else, people aren't paying for shipping, 2, 3, 4 times. Because that in a normal world that wouldn't be that bad, but it really has gotten that way. In addition to that, the I can't say enough good things about the way that the team at Zoop just handles these campaigns. They've done a great job of setting up things, get the word out. They've done a great job at just planning out the campaign, the tiers, just really helping me out so I could focus on the book. And the difference just in production has been huge because I'm, as you know, done with issue 4. On the other campaigns, I would maybe be between 5 and 10 pages into it while I was running a campaign. And I was able to just finish this up because I wasn't spending the month before the campaign, checking shipping rates every day, seeing what was maybe, is there a rumor that they're going to raise shipping rates again down the line? Do I have to worry about that? What's going on with shipping to Canada? All these really crazy things that the more you end up looking into them, the more time it takes and the more chance they are going to then change again on you. So it just made a lot of sense logistically and personally as well. They're just great people to work with. I love talking with them, and they've been just really done a great job at letting me focus on the parts of this that I should, which is essentially the book.
Yeah, I found Zoop very interesting, and it's been. I'm sure they've been around longer, but I feel like they popped up like the past year, maybe even less of a time frame up to kind of notice them. And yeah, I've been hearing that a lot from the creators like yourself. Like they kind of take one of the big hurdles away, which is fulfillment and shipping and all that. So was that the main reason for going with them? Was just you felt like this took such a headache off of me, and I don't want to deal with this anymore. What else do they provide that maybe convince you to move away from Kickstarter and over to them?
Well, it wasn't so much that they, provided, because I was actually using Kablam for fulfillment and shipping as in the first 3, and I don't want to say anything negative about them. They've been great as well. The great things about Zoop, I would say, essentially are they are for their comics people, which I think is a huge plus over Kickstarter. There were times where backers would ask me questions on 1 through 3 about how something was going to work, basically on Kickstarter's end, like an answer that I couldn't give them. I would email Kickstarter support team after going through a million chatbots, and I would never hear back. Because comics are not their primary reason for existing. The gaming stuff is so much bigger. There's just bigger stuff out there. We're not the biggest part of their business. So I didn't really feel like I got as much attention there as I wanted from them when I was, trying to get an issue solved for a backer. In addition to that, they have great connections within the comic world and they had suggestions about what to offer with this campaign that were great that I would not have thought of, but they've done this a bunch of times before because they're comics people. They were actually offering some original art prints. I do all my stuff digitally, but they were suggesting we kind of offer a one-time only print of a page that we would send with a certificate of authenticity. And my thought was like, do people want that? They said, oh yeah, people go and get that all the time. So I would never have thought to go down that road had they not suggested it, but those have done pretty well. And so that's mainly it. And the fact that they handled a lot of the campaign planning, the timing, the what's this going to cost, what's shipping going to cost. They have fantastic relationships with. I'm not sure the exact shipping. I have it in my head, but I don't want to say it in case I'm wrong. The fulfillment partners they have, and they have great relationships with printers as well, so the cost could be a lot lower per print on top of that. So those are the main things. They have great relationships with vendors, they're comics people, and they have great insight into specifically how these campaigns work and what comic readers will support and want to see in a crowdfunding campaign.
Yeah, I like their outreach too because they're
Yeah.
so focused on comics. They're actually reaching out to and doing a good job advertising the different books that they're doing
Uh-huh.
and actually giving them spotlight. I also kind of like with them, I don't know if this is done on purpose. I got to assume it is, but they don't take on a lot. So they almost act like a publisher in sorts where they can take on
Hmm.
like 4 or 5 and then really focus in on them and give
Yeah.
them the spotlight they deserve, which is really cool.
Yeah, it feels more like a comics experience somehow. And you compared them to a publisher, which I think I see what you're saying there, because it feels just more. It's not like this sort of open, everything's on here, you sort through it sort of a thing, which Kickstarter kind of is. And I don't want to say bad things about Kickstarter, but that it's just a different experience where this is just our little comics pond when you come to Zoop, and I think that that's also great. Like I said, because they've run comics campaign and they'll sit down and say, hey, this works well in a comics campaign. We did this on this one, it worked out well, which is just something you're not going to get from Kickstarter or a lot of the other. I don't know crowdfunder does that or not, but I don't imagine you get that from Indiegogo, and I don't think you get that from Kickstarter.
Yeah, definitely. So, like we said on the top, you're doing issue 4 and then the full trade, which is going to be a hardcover.
Yeah.
So for issue 4, how I mean, how was it just finishing up this book for you? Like, I mean, I know when I first talked to you, you talked about the love that went into the issue and how this was kind of partially like mostly a dream project for you. How does it feel now to be quote unquote done with it, or at least at the end of this first story arc?
It feels weird. It feels weird just to be done with. All right, I got to get this page done. I want to send this out, and I need to make some fixes to a few things from the version that you've read.
Mm-hmm.
But fundamentally, it was done. I think last Saturday morning. So that has felt strange. Just to be. I mean, I have things to do. I like I said, changes. I need to be putting together the extras that are going into the hardcover edition, and that's going to have a ton of sketches, commentary, things that went into the story, and that's kind of what differentiates it from the Red 5 trade that's going to come out once the series is completed in comic shops. That's going to be just pretty much a standard trade that you expect to see. And we wanted the hardcover to not step on the toes of that and be a little different. So it's kind of, if you are a big Scarlet Twilight fan, if you've really liked it and you want to see a lot more artwork and things that went into the story, that's what you'll get that in the hardcover, because there's going to be tons and tons of extras in addition to it being a kind of premium hardcover product.
That's great. I'm looking forward to the hardcover more than anything. I mean, it just the pictures you have on here look really fantastic. I like the binding of it and everything. It really pops off the shelf, so I'm excited to get my hands on that.
Oh, cool.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about issue 4, and I'll try to. We're gonna do our best to stay away from any kind of spoilers. So
Okay.
there
We'll try
is
our best,
one.
but I don't get too upset about particular spoilers. So, I'm really pumped to talk about issue 4 with people. You're one of the first people to have read it. So, uh, interested to hear what people think, I guess.
So I really liked a lot of it. I love the book. But there's certain things throughout it. One of them being, so the main character we have here, Captain Lancet, is a 1930s character
Mm-hmm.
who's then kind of thrusted in the future, and he has that 1930s feel to it. And we learn a little bit about his backstory, which was really cool to see. It added almost another twist on top of the issue 1 twist of where he came from that I really liked, and it added a different dynamic to this kind of speech you give in the issue about the, what's the best way to put it, not what America is, but what the hope of America is.
Yeah. Yeah.
That scene was one of the best Captain America-esque scenes I've seen in comics. Like, I love, that's to me always what Captain America is. He's the dream incarnate of what America should be.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that sequence. I mean, as much as you can talk about it, like what went into that moment for you in the book?
Well, I think it sounds like it. You really hit the nail on the head. This is, I think, from the end of issue 3, where he kind of lays it all out. Like, here's where I'm from. Here's why I do what I do. When they're at that sort of old campground place. Yeah, that's. I did want that to be a Captain America speech in a lot of ways. Like, I thought, I had that issue of Civil War in mind. Actually, I think it was a Civil War spinoff that Ron Garney drew, and I think J. Michael Straczynski wrote, where Captain America gives that like 20 panel speech to Spider Man, which is a lot of words to have on the page, but it was a really good speech. And I think has been memorable because of that. That was definitely the inspiration for that particular page in a lot of ways. The other thing that went into that is when I was reading a lot of these old Golden Age comics, kind of as research, uh, it was really surprising how much everybody remembers, Batman selling war bonds on the covers and things like that, or handing the soldier the gun and everything like that. But it's surprising, even more so, how much politics were in those books. You'd have people having like really sort of not complicated, but sort of like the level of discourse you'd see in like a grade school textbook conversations about fascism or democracy and this and that in these old stories, which and I kept seeing it over and over and over again. So I did think that there was a good opportunity to play off of that in a way that was surprising, given his origins. And as far as how it tied together in terms of his motivations, I always have said I think it makes like comic book sense for him to say, "Well, I was a king back in the day, and here were the good things, and here were the bad things." And when I ran into this new country and this new way of doing things, I bought in. I was into it. This was a good thing, and I fought to defend it. And I hope it's a little bit of a surprise because up until that moment in the story, I had hoped that you were learning a little bit as you learned a little bit more about him, and I kind of trickled that out throughout issues 2 and 3. I was hoping that you'd kind of be like, well, maybe he was just doing this because he had this other thing he was trying to conceal. Maybe this whole facade of being a crime fighter was not completely on the up and up, or he had ulterior motives. And I wanted that moment in issue 3 where he lays it all out was actually one of the big moments of the story where when I sat down and sort of broke the whole thing down, that was almost the climax for me. He's like, no, man, I'm down with this. I'm a hero. I believe in these things. I'm not just pretending. And I wanted to write a character like that because I think a lot of times there's so much deconstruction lately in comics ever since the 80s that I wanted to have a character that was what he said he was. But I also wanted to take time to make that, at least in the plot sense, plausible. So I hope that would give it more impact, that it does make a little bit of sense, ideally.
Yeah, it's one of those things in the conversation where I think people are talking past each other a lot, and this is what I mean by that is, like you said, politics have always been there in comics and in most media, and I think what we're seeing, I think people have more of a spotlight because this was definitely happened back in the day too. But I think what people react to is when the politics in something isn't treated properly
Mm-hmm.
or treated like ham-fisted as
Yeah.
opposed to nuanced and within the bounds. Because I always, like you talked about some of the Golden Age books, I always go back to when people got mad about politics and Captain America. I was like, this is the dude that there's issues of him talking about why it was anti-American to fight the drug war.
Yeah.
Like, this is nothing new for this character. It's just knowing who Steve is and using that character as a voice for what his politics would be, and then churning your message in there with it, doing it
Mm-hmm.
smart is how I always put it. And that's what I took away from that scene is I could tell that you spent a lot of time in that scene, and that
Oh
wasn't
yeah.
written down one afternoon then thrown
No.
away. Like you went
No, it
through
was
that a
not.
few times and were like, we need to get this speech right,
Yeah.
and
Well,
it
it
really
was hard
showed
to
off with
cut it
it.
down, honestly, because there was just a lot to be. There's a lot to cover there. And the flashback helped because I could dress that up with some good visuals, and also, in addition to being a vampire, there's a further twist to that, and that's kind of why I don't mind giving away the initial twist on his character. He's not just any old vampire. He's one of the big ones, and I was able to kind of round off some of the because that particular historical figure was probably a pretty nasty character, and I kind of said, well, he's that guy, but it wasn't exactly like it actually was in real life. It were monsters, and it wasn't that bad, sort of a thing in terms of his character. So there was the flashback. The flashback, I'm sorry, helped, but yeah, that speech did take a long time to write and to condense as well. I think the condensing was the hardest part.
Yeah, and as I said, as a reader, it shows, and it shows that there was care put into it, and that's what I want personally in all of my comics, but especially when you try to broach these subjects, like treat it with the care it deserves, and I really think you did that well. There's
Thanks.
also a moment
Thanks.
inside of there where he talks about being back in the 30s that I love because he talks about the bloodlust. He's like,
Yeah.
"Well, I used to go to this diner. I'm gonna get it wrong, but I went to this diner and there was this like egg salad sandwich or something along those lines,
Yeah.
and it had like the right protein in it, and it kind of it threw me back to like early Venom when they're like, we need to make Venom a good guy, so he eats what was it, peanut butter?
Oh, I don't think I've read that, but yeah, I'm totally doing the same cheat that they were doing
Yeah,
here, where I have to kind of round the edges off of this sort of thing in a way that makes it a little more digestible for him to be a hero. Yes, I'm
yeah,
definitely doing the same thing they were.
that a great moment. That was so much fun.
There was a show called The Alienist that might still be on. I think it was on TNT, and there's a there. It takes place in I think maybe the early 1900s or the late 1800s, and it's a great period show. It takes place in New York City, and it's like a murder mystery. And they have a lot of good historical references in there. And one character's like, "Oh, I'm going to go get an egg cream," and I thought that sounds so. I'm sure I've heard of it before or read about it in a novel I had to read for school, but I was like, "That's a great sort of period detail." And I thought I jotted that down, and I wanted to throw that in some way. And so in issues 1 and 2, I think in the thank you page for the Kickstarter versions, I think I put promotional consideration provided by Second Avenue Egg Cream, and that pays off in issue 3 when he mentions it, and then issue 4 he finds out what has become of his favorite diner in the future. But yeah, that had been like playing out throughout the series, and it kind of came from just hearing that old phrase and thinking like, what is that weird old drink? I want to throw that into my book because it just gives you that this is not something you hear every day, and it really puts you in the where the characters come from in terms of their time period and their roots.
Yeah, it's a fun little comic book moment too. It's
I hope so.
it's one of those things that like if they did it in the movie version, or if assuming we get a movie version one day, if they did it in the movie version, you'd be like, that's weird. But as a comic fan, I'm like, it's so comic books, and I love it. I love those quirky little things that we do in our medium. It's what makes
Yeah.
it. It's part of what
Well,
makes it special.
well, and that's one of the things that was great about this series is there were so many things that the thing that really got me thinking in this line about just taking advantage of the comic language was when Stephen King was rewriting his gunslinger novels in the Marvel comics in graphic novels, and he wrote like he sat down and did the work and made it a comic, and he had like thought bubbles and stuff, and the editors say, "Oh, we don't really do that anymore." He's like, "Why would you throw away thought bubbles? Those are great. Where else can you do those but in comics? That's so stupid." And I agree. In doing research for this, there's great things that those old comics would do that we don't really that did not continue to be used and become kind of your standard comic book thing, at least as far as modern comics are concerned. They would cut through scenes really quickly because they wanted to get the story moving as quickly as possible. So sometimes you'd see Batman. The analogy I've always, or the illustration that I've always described is you'd see Batman go into a office, and instead of him like looking around, he looks under the desk, he looks under the chair, he finally finds the clue in a safe. They just say they have a text panel that says Batman looked around for a few minutes and then he found the thing. And I'm like, well, that's great. You should do that. Nobody wants to see 3 panels of Batman like doing this and doing that and doing this. There were a lot of good opportunities when you look at these old comics to see storytelling tricks they used, and in ways that were great. I thought, well, that's fantastic. I'm going to use that. That moves me along in the story so much faster and lets me kind of fast forward through the boring parts in a way that makes sense and is true to the period. So there was a lot of opportunities there, and the egg cream story is one of them because I could put that kind of almost like one of the advertisements you'd see in a comic, and then it actually enters the story in issue 4. So there's a lot of opportunities to do things like that in comics, and I'm a comics person. I love movies. Video games are great. When I used to play them, I don't have time anymore. I love all those other mediums, but we're comics people, and I'm always looking for ways to be like, I want to, if I'm going to do a comic book, I want to do the most comic booky comic I can do. I want to take advantage of every tool that we have in comics, because otherwise, why shouldn't it just be a bunch of storyboards?
Yeah, and you do that. I think I said this when we talked last time, but you do that well with not only panel layout, but like using your splash pages properly and making them feel. Obviously, I read it digitally. I think when I get the physical splash pages, especially on physical, I just think pop better.
Yeah, they do.
But I like the way they're laid out in terms of because I was kind of counting the pages as I was going along. I'm like, okay, that's where I could tell that you were like, okay, this is where they're going to flip the page, and that's when the splash is going to hit.
Hmm.
And I love that as a part of it too, because it's such an important thing for creators to know where they're placing things in the book as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, that's the approach to the splashes was really fun because one of the things you see in those little comics is you generally would have a 9 panel grid. Sometimes you'd have even more than that. And what I would try to do is take if I had 3 pages and maybe over that 27 panels, I would cram a lot of those panels into one or two of the pages. So I'd have like 10 panel pages at points, and then go to a page with a big splash and then one small panel. I mean, I want to distribute that out in a way that makes sense given the period I'm kind of drawing upon, which the old Golden Age comics, where you would see a ton of panels on the page, and then just do as much contrast as possible, and then like go from something that's really old fashioned. And generally, when I'd have the pages with a lot of panels, I would also kind of make them as undynamic at times as I could, right before I go to a page that's a little more Neil Adams or something like that, where you get foreshortening, you got a big image, you got things coming at the viewer. So I kind of would be like, this is sort of a Winsor McCay layout, and I'd go to the splash that would be a little more Neil Adams or Brian Hitch.
Definitely. And do you also do all of your own coloring for the book?
Yeah, I do.
Okay,
Yeah, colors, letters, everything.
this is one I really I hope you agree. I don't want to spoil this, but there's a character that pops up near the end of the book.
Hmm.
And the coloring you do on it, and I kind of went back to the first issue because I was trying to see if you did it in the first issue as well with a different character. And it really did pop the way it was colored, almost like that character compared to everybody else, where everybody else has this very, I don't want to say cartoony, but it's almost a flat coloring
Yeah.
style. And this one almost pops out as 3D, as like other dimensional almost.
Well,
And I
he is in
really,
fact other dimensional, so that's the
yeah,
idea.
and I really loved the way it contrasted with everybody else on the page and popped out. So if as much as you can you go into what went into that?
Absolutely, yeah. No, this is cool to talk about. So the character you're talking about is in fact other dimensional, and the idea behind him is that he does not belong here. He doesn't look right. In fact, if you notice, the other characters can see his word balloons when he talks. Like he's not Deadpool. He's not talking to the viewer, but he does not exist in the same reality that the other characters do. And in fact, I color them a lot flatter when he's around, just to give it a little contrast. As far as creating him, I tried to make him look even more CG than he is. He is kind of computer generated. If you look at his costume details or his uniform or his, I guess, equipment might be the best way to describe it. The way I approached it was I wanted to do something like those collages Kirby would do in Fantastic Four, where it would suddenly be like Xeroxes, and then you'd have an inset of Reed Richards of the Thing in it, but everything would be, grayscale photographs with Zipatone and things like that. It would be a completely different reality. So that character is computer generated as far as his figure is concerned, and as far as his accoutrements and his kind of suit or equipment, those are all like images I've taken and manipulated, and I tried to make them look really flat. I thought they would look a lot more disjointed than they actually do. They work in a lot of ways that I was surprised to see, because I wanted him to look very. If he were a character in a movie, like the things he would do when he would turn, all his things would not turn with him. He wouldn't exactly exist in the right perspective. He's here, but he's not really here in our, I guess 3-dimensional reality is the best way to describe it. So I kind of did him in a completely different way, and then I used a lot of effects to make him, like the sort of screen printing effect on him, and sort of we have a little bit of a channel offset there where his red tones and his green tones are a little bit like 10 pixels apart in most of the panels. So that was the idea there, is that he was supposed to look very different. The characters don't react to him in the same way that they do to each other. He breaks a lot of the rules of the sort of reality of the panel to panel storytelling that exists for everybody else. So that's something you'll see. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to handle it in the sequel, because he'll be back, which I think he kind of lets you know he will at the end of the story. I'm trying to figure out how I want to approach it in that one, because I'm going to do this next story a little bit differently and try to make it a little bit more faithful to those old 1940s comics than this one was.
Yeah, and it works because I was trying to describe it to somebody. The character almost doesn't fit, while at the same time feeling like he belongs.
Mhm.
And I'm positive as a reader that that's what you were going for. Like, he's not of
Yeah,
this world, so he doesn't fit in with what the aesthetic of the world is, but he is existing in it. Is kind of what
yeah,
I'm trying to say.
yeah.
And I
He
really do think that it's
tenuously
not that way.
exists
Yeah.
in the world. He's kind of. I almost see him as like he's when Reed Richards goes into the negative zone, or something like that. It's kind of that idea.
Yeah.
He's here, but it's difficult for him to be here. He needs things from our world, but he can't really like sit down and you know sit in a chair in our world. It's a weird relationship that they'll get a lot more into in the sequel, which is going to be a kind of a it's going to be a little longer. It's going to be the structure of it's going to be a little different. I'm kind of approaching it as if it was Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it was done in 1940. So it's going to be different universes, different character. I'm going to have some characters show up that I think will really surprise people, um, and kind of take the story in that direction. And I'm going to try and be a lot more faithful, like I said, to the older comics, because what I'm going to be doing this one is a little bit more straightforward. In that I compare We Are Scarlet Twilight to Rocky, the first Rocky movie, where the resolution of that movie is not necessarily is he going to win the fight, but it's about revealing his character.
Hmm.
Can he really do this? Is he a bum, or can he get up there and fight with Apollo Creed? Uh, is Adrian going to be a wallflower? Or is she going to go there and root for him? Like the climaxes are not does he win the fight? It's does he become who he's supposed to be? And I think that's kind of the types of questions I was answering with We Are Scarlet Twilight. Although there are obviously plot, victories and losses in the story. The next story, I can't really do that over again because we have those answers about those characters, but I can kind of take it in a little bit more of a Game of Thrones direction, in that the suspense will come with like who's going to make it out of this, how are they going to get through these problems, and what's going to happen to these people. So that's kind of the direction I'm taking it.
So you kind of answered the question I was going to get to a little bit later, but since we're on it, it's probably a good time to talk about it, which is sequel. I know every creator loves talking about the sequel when they're trying to get the first one done, but
We do.
uh, do you see the next story arc as, like, if you're doing this tomorrow, do you see it as issue 5, or do you see it as We Are Scarlet Twilight season 2 number 1?
Probably the latter. It's more of a like I said, the tone's going to be very different, and I don't think that there would be a satisfying reader experience. Just kind of find ways to repeat what I did in Scarlet Twilight One. It's like I said, it's about kind of really revealing that character, and he gives you that Captain America speech, and then you figure out how he does actually win this fight, if he does. For people who haven't read it, those are the big, I think, sources of suspense for the first story. I don't think that's going to be satisfying to just do over to kind of remix into another story that kind of covers the same bases. So I think it definitely is more of a season two. Yeah, I would actually compare it to something that changes mediums in the way that, say, Star Trek was a TV show for a while and they came back with a series of motion pictures. It's a slightly different thing that is a continuation of the same characters, but the medium is obviously it's the same medium. It's a comic book, but the structure is very different. The sense of how much is a serialization type of a story is different. The types of plot points we focus on are different. So I would almost compare it to Star Trek the series to Star Trek the motion picture through Star Trek 6. It's like we're continuing the story, but we're doing it under a very different structure.
Interesting. So we have that to look forward to, everybody. But right now, what we have to look forward to
Yeah.
is We Are Scarlet Twilight issue 4 and the hardcover trade paperback on Zoop. But not only that, you also penned a deal with Red 5 to publish the at least the first arc,
Yeah.
and that is in previews right now. So I guess my first question is why Red 5, and then to kind of continue with that, I mean, how has been going through the publishing line been for the series as well?
Oh, well, they've been great. Working with Red 5 was actually when I was pitching my series August to a lot of publishers, I sent it to them and didn't hear back from them on that one, but ended up going with a different publisher that didn't work out as things progressed during the pandemic. In the meantime, I'd done Scarlet Twilight on Kickstarter, thinking that if you've read the book, you know it's very golden age, and you almost have to know a lot about those old comics to get. I mean, I think my mom could read it and understand the story, but I don't think she'd understand a lot of the references or why the characters maybe speak the way that they do, or why what, the pacing of it, or things like that. You kind of have to be a comic fan to get those things. Even if you're not into those old comics, you've probably seen some of them, and you're like, oh yeah, this is like the old Dick Tracy comics, the old Justice Society comics. I get that sort of thing. So I thought, well, it's kind of niche. I'll put it in Kickstarter and see what happens. It did pretty well. And Red 5 actually contacted me about doing a version for shops. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. I've liked the books they've put out before. Their team, I've been working with Josh Starnes and Scott Chitwood, and they've both been fantastic to work with. So that was pretty much as simple as it was. Excuse me.
Yeah, and so everybody, I mean, that's out in previews right now, so you can make sure to check
Mm-hmm.
that out. And I guess my last thing, you have said a few times like the golden age inspiration, and I do agree. It's with any new medium to get a new person in is always something. But for people that are into comics, the thing that came to mind as you were discussing it as that golden age inspiration is something I see in the video game world a lot, which is it almost feels like a remake of a classic golden age book, but not a one for one remake of what the book actually is, but more of a one to one remake of what your memory of that book
Mm-hmm.
actually is. And I think that's why it hit with so many people is it didn't. Some of those golden age books can be rough. I mean, I
Yeah.
love comics. I love those old comics, but they can be rough at times. That's why I don't really hand somebody the Flash from 1960 something. I
Mm-hmm.
If somebody wants to get into comics, I probably hand them The Dark Knight or
Yeah.
Kingdom Come or something like that. And I think that's something you pull off really well here. Is it does have a lot of inspiration, but it doesn't drag like a lot of those old books do. It feels like a remake. It feels like a refresh of the style.
Yeah, that was the goal, was to, and it was the goal in two ways. I wanted to, I think this ended up being the first Scarlet Twilight ended up being a lot more modern than when I set out to do this, I planned on it being. It was, and that served the story. I don't regret that in any sense, because I want to structure it using what I can from those old comics to get the most impact in the story I'm doing at the time. And I think that what We Are Scarlet Twilight is represents that. This is taking, I sort of have the golden age stuff. I have the expectations of modern comics and modern comics readers. And I guess my job is to kind of mix those spices together into the best thing that particular dish can be. I did initially think it was going to be a little more retro than it ended up being. And that's one of the things I kind of want to go back to with the sequel is initially I had a few ideas for a sequel that I didn't think were good enough. And then as a few more things piled on there, I thought that's probably enough. But I think the thing that made me really excited about going back to it in the future is there's a lot more on the table, I think, that I didn't use from those old comics that could really be applied here and be fun. They have so many storytelling because they were just creating this art form. There were not a lot of rules. There were not a lot of expectations aside from the ones their editors had. So you had a lot of experimentation, a lot of things that worked. Even though if you sit down and read those comics, the Batman ones are okay, Superman ones are so. Justice Society is hard to read. A lot of the America's Best, like Black Terror, those guys are really bland. Captain Marvel's actually pretty good, but it varies, but they're not that exciting to go back and read. Captain Marvel is probably the best of those old ones, the old Fawcett ones. But if you really look back at those, it's like you want, there is something that's so cool, you kind of keep looking at them. And that's kind of what kept me coming back to the idea of doing this. And if I compare it to if you've ever seen the movie Tron from
Oh
the
yeah.
80s, yeah, so Tron's a cool idea and it looks cool. And I can still watch it and appreciate it for what it is. But it is a tough watch. It's really slow. It's really not quite what you want it to be. And yet you see why they came back to it, because like there was something really cool about it, even though that movie is like really, really tough to get through. There's something about it that there's like, yeah, I want that, but I want it to work. And that's kind of what I've been experimenting with this character and with this plot. Is I'm trying to take a lot of things I see in there, the atmosphere, the color, the attitudes, and then also really the directness of the storytelling, and to try and do something that works now, but doesn't give you that the drag I guess you get from, there's really racist elements in those old comics. They can be slow at times. The art's not terribly dynamic. The art's also pretty uneven depending on the artist and how much time they had to do it. So I kind of wanted to sift through it and take out the bad stuff and really highlight the good stuff, because there is some good stuff out there that I don't think I've seen a lot of in modern comics. That I think there's an appetite to see. Certainly, as a reader, I want to see more of that stuff. So if you look at like Matt Wagner, he did a few miniseries for DC where he revisited a couple of Golden Age Batman stories. Those are really cool. I like to see stuff like that. And so that's the idea, is just I want to go back and mine some of that atmosphere and that approach into a more modern storytelling package.
Yeah, quick aside, Marvel's doing, I think it's Paul Levitt's writing it, is
Oh,
doing a Avengers book that takes place back in the, I want to say issue 11. It's,
oh, I know that. Is Alan Davis drawing it?
yes, 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 War Across
Yeah,
Time.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's a blast. I love going back to it. I'll tell you what though, that dynamic between Giant Man and Wasp back in the day
Hmm.
is rough. I forgot like their dynamic was a little out there for somebody in 2023.
Yeah. Well, I think they hit on something there, because I have seen a few panels of that. Any, as far as at least the comic versions are concerned, I mean, I never liked Ant Man, because coming up when I did, and I think you're a little younger than me. Like I just knew Ant Man as the guy that hit the Wasp. Like that's all he was. Whereas some of my older colleagues that I work with, they're like, "Oh yeah, Ant Man's cool," and they didn't even know that happened. And like to me, that's all he was, and so I never really liked him. And I also think Yellow Jacket is stupid and all that, but I've never
Also,
liked
my
that inner. Oh, sorry,
I
I've
was gonna
never
say
liked
my
that version
first
of the
Ant Man
character.
was the irredeemable Ant Man, so it
Oh,
wasn't
okay,
even Scott or not even Scott. It wasn't even I'm zoning right now. Hank. It wasn't even Hank. That was my first Ant Man. Like it was the
yeah,
third or fourth Ant Man that was my first Ant Man. So yeah, I have a different perspective on him.
yeah. I never appreciated the concept, because I'm not that into. I mean, I don't particularly like the Atom either, but that's all I knew about that guy. I was like, oh, that's the guy that hit the Wasp. That's kind of icky. I don't really want to get that in my comic book reading experience. But if you look at, and this is something I was really playing with the reveal on who Captain Lancet really was, is I know that I think the expectation when I revealed some of the things about him in the first issue about being a vampire, I think the expectation is from modern storytelling. Oh, well, he's like Dexter. He's doing this to be able to be a vampire, but kind of cover it up. And I think that when you look at the dynamic, if you're going to revisit the Wasp and Ant Man before any of the dark stuff happened, you kind of that a modern reader is thinking of that, even if you're going to show them in sunnier times. And I think that dynamic of I know that people probably expect this to go this way, or even to be hinted at or addressed in some way, is something I was very aware of when writing Captain Lancet's dialogue and his actions. Is I know that people probably think he's going to be a little bit of an anti-hero, a little bit tarnished, and I wanted to leave room for that, because I knew there was probably an expectation of a bit of a deconstructionist approach to him. And it sounds like that's, I think, any time where you've seen a retro approach to the Avengers, they've always had a nod in there that there was something not right about their dynamic, because
Yeah.
we expect that later on to, we know that happens 5 years from then.
Yeah, it's not to get too much into it because we're here to promote your book, but it's not even like that as much as I forget how much, because I've read some old Avengers. Marvel's more my bag, so I usually a lot of
Mm-hmm.
my older Marvel or reading is Marvel, and I forget like how much of a horn dog Janet was.
Oh yeah, no, she was always like fawning over Thor and stuff like that, and you're like, it's weird. It's weird to see that, and it's so much weirder to see it knowing what the character, where it
Yeah,
went. And like I said, my impression was just how that unfolded. That but it is weird to see how they handle that. And I remember, I think I was reading the George Perez and might have been Jeff Johns was writing it, the sort of post Heroes Reborn Avengers, and they were all sitting around a pool, and Jan was just flirting with everybody and talking about like, oh, I've been with Hawkeye and I've been with this person now, like, and I'm like, this is weird, but I guess it was kind of there in the old comics. They just weren't being as explicit about it. But I can't say it wasn't like hinted at either.
yeah. That run was something else. I actually didn't even I didn't know that run was a thing until later on, and I was like, wait, Jeff Johns wrote for Marvel, and then it's
Yeah.
one of those things like Jason Aaron's done stuff at DC, and guys have done across Medium all the time, but you think of them as one company all the time, and it's
Mm-hmm.
weird. So the book We Are Scarlet Twilight, Benjamin. Before we hop off and move on with our night, where could I send people to follow you? Do you want them to go to Twitter, or is there somewhere else that you post on social media?
Well, mainly, I mean, obviously the book is at Zoop right now, but as far as future stuff, follow me on Twitter and follow me on my YouTube channel. And I post a lot in each place. And I kind of, on Twitter, I'm mostly posting artwork and, going into a little bit of story things and things that have influenced me. I'll post like some artwork from the comic and maybe a few other panels of classic artwork from other artists that like, hey, this is kind of what made me think to do this. Which, in addition to just giving a nod to those creators, is a cool and a little bit of education. It's also cool just to see nice, cool, high res pictures of that old stuff. On my YouTube channel, I go into commentary on my existing books. I show off artwork, a little bit of process, and do a lot of stuff. And also where I go into a lot of my influences and kind of pick apart what makes those artists great, in my opinion, and also how they've influenced my work. So the YouTube channel and the Twitter account are the best places to find me.
And to everyone out there watching, listening, as always, I will have those links in the show notes down below. You should all check out We Are Scarlet Twilight on Zoop. If you're not a crowdfunding person, which I know a few of you are, I will also have the link to the previews catalog so that you can show it to your local comic shop or use the Pullbox app to put it on your pull list. And I highly, highly recommend that you do. I'm not. I don't say it often, but this is one of my favorite, if not my favorite book in crowdfunding right now. It is a phenomenal book. So Benjamin, thank you so much for
Thanks.
taking the time to come chat with me, and I look forward to the next time we can chat and the next time we see Captain Lanzet in the page.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.